Prime Minister Modi's visit to Russia could be a path-breaking visit. It could almost effect a paradigm shift in relations and in the overall international architecture of power play. Why do I say that? Well, let me tell you one thing. We had a very strong relationship in the Soviet era. But you know, there was one characteristic. Both the Soviet economy and the Indian economy were going downhill. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, splintered into 15 states, and the Indian economy virtually came to a collapse in the same year 1990. There were a lot of symbiotic linkages, both public sector behemoths, and we came close to collapse almost together. This time around, both the Indian economy is on the upswing and so is the Russian economy. For the first time, despite the sanctions, it is on the upward trajectory, on the upward graph, both of them. The Indian economy has come from the 10th largest GDP to the 5th largest GDP and is now heading for the 3rd largest GDP in the world and a 5 trillion economy. So is the Russian economy, growing almost 3.2%. Despite each and every sanction that has been put, it's only rebounded and grown. So both are on a growth upward trajectory, and that is why the outlook is extremely positive, extremely optimistic. Second fact, this is a summit where we might see the play of some very creative impulses. Let me explain. You know, when the Ukraine war began and the West imposed major economic sanctions on the Russians, in fact, it's my personal assessment that the primary aim of this war was to get an excuse to poke Russia in the eye till it invaded Ukraine and then impose heavy penal sanctions which could derail the Russian economy and kind of do a redux of what had happened in 1990. This thing totally failed, and the two countries that really bailed out Russia, that really helped Russia survive this economic onslaught, were India and China. Both of them increased their oil imports from the Russians. 40% of India's crude oil export now comes from Russia. Russia is the second biggest supplier. 80 billion barrels per year it is the oil that India is importing from Russia. Similarly, even the Chinese have massively increased their purchase of Russian energy. This primarily helped the Russians tide over the sanctions, the economic sanctions. China also stepped in to fill the breach. When the Americans, the European companies pulled out of Russia, it is China which stepped in to fill the breach in terms of providing automobiles. India also has a very dynamic, vibrant automobile sector, but we failed to make any dent or to try and enter the Russian market because our private sector was quite worried, quite concerned about the sanctions and about the payment problems, etc. So we have bailed out Russia in a very critical moment of its history when the Western intentions were to engineer a complete economic collapse as had happened in the 1990s. Don't forget, at that time the Americans had forced Saudi Arabia to create an oil glut, get the price of oil down in the international market in 1986 from $30 a barrel to $10 a barrel, and thereby they had crashed the Soviet economy then. And that had led to the collapse and demise of the Soviet Union. So, I mean, it was something like that which was being attempted, that Europe would stop purchasing, which had such strong energy linkages with the Russians, and the basis of their economic growth was the very cheap Russian energy they were getting, which was such close economic sort of geographical proximity that the costs were so low. Now because of this, what had happened as far as India and Russia were concerned was a balance of payment crisis. We had agreed to do ruble-rupee trade, but the Russians were exporting to you a massive amount of energy exports. But in India's purchases from Russia were quite minimal. So there was this balance of payment crisis which was quite aggravated, quite serious, that what would Russia do with all the rupees that it had now hoarded because of India's accelerated energy purchases. So a very creative solution has been found in this present summit, and we are going to see the outcome in writing very shortly. But these could be path breaking. India had paid in rupees to the Russians for the oil imports. Russians did not know what to do with the rupees, so they have put their heads together and come out with some brilliant solutions. These pertain to defense. In fact, there are three major fields that I will focus on. One is energy security, of which I have already talked quite a bit. Second is national security, primarily defense. And the third is connectivity issues, especially in terms of trade corridors. So let me take these one by one. I have spoken at length about energy security, and we found that because of India's accelerated purchase, enhanced purchases of Russian oil, for which we paid for in rupees, the Russians have a huge pile of rupees, which India has not been, unlike China, which has been selling a whole lot of other products, consumer goods, etc., to the Russians, and they very neatly, adroitly exploited the retreat of the Americans and Europeans from the Russian market. They have gone in. The Russian economy has survived because it is a market economy. It is not a command economy anymore. That is why it has survived. Because when the Americans went out, Europeans went out, they simply brought in the Chinese consumer goods, the Chinese cars, Chinese automobiles, etc., and they have managed to survive. We had to find a way out. We were tinkering with the ideas of why can't our car manufacturers also export to exploit the Russian market the way the Chinese have done? Why have we not been as adroit? So the solution that has been suggested, that is being worked out in this summit, is, like I said, very innovative. Defense. If Russia has a whole hoard of rupees, how does it spend it? India can buy defense items, and those rupees can then be usefully expended. The simple fact is that India and Russia are going to carry out joint production of Su-57. That is under discussion and on the table. Su-57, fifth generation stealth fighter aircraft, number one. Number two, S-400 surface to air missile batteries, the most advanced SAMs in the whole world, which have proven their worth in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. India had ordered 5 of these batteries. 3 had come in, and quite obviously because of the war, the Russians were constrained. They needed them desperately themselves. They could not be supplied to us. So one of the purposes of this visit of the Prime Minister was to expedite the delivery of the balance 2 batteries. But what I am being given to understand is there is also a proposal to make India the hub, the hub of repair and spare parts of the Su-400, because a lot of the world after this conflict would be looking for these S-400 missiles, and when the Indian defense establishment makes a purchase of a particular equipment, the whole world knows that it has been thoroughly tested and certified. If India certifies it, the rest of the world will line up to buy that particular product. So that is what has happened. And there are also, we are already the manufacturer of AK-203 assault rifles for the entire Indian Army has started. First 30,000 rifles have already been delivered. And I was also given to understand, as part of the rupee payment problems, the Russians took some of these assault rifles because they were also expanding their armed forces for the purposes of this particular conflict. Before I shift to connectivity, let me also point out two other related factors. As far as energy is concerned, one of the other primary plank of our energy security is to go for non-fossil fuels and fossil fuel replacements. And one of the options was the nuclear energy, which is a major option. In fact, some of the first nuclear plants were set, major nuclear plants were set with Russian assistance. We had signed a nuclear deal with the United States, but nothing came out of it except a lot of sound and fury. But it is the Russians which have been following up, and we've had two major nuclear projects coming up under the Russians. This time, Rosatom has offered to supply 6 major nuclear plants to India. And quite obviously, that will also help in that ruble kind of a trade that we are doing. But 6 major nuclear plants are likely to be supplied to India as part of that energy security deal. And like I said, coming on to military security per se, the biggest thing to come out of it would be the Su-57 joint development deal, which had been started, then it had been shelved, gone into cold storage, it has been revived, and it could be one hell of a contender for the 125 aircraft that India is on the lookout for. The Americans have been willing to offer the F-35. The Europeans are almost talking of the Typhoon, and where the French were dragging their feet initially on the 26 additional Rafales for the Navy. I mean, that deal has also been this thing. So the whole paradigm shift in this scenario would come in if India goes in for a 5th generation aircraft in tandem with the Russians. Our own AMCA would take another 10 to 15 years to develop, and to that extent we need a stopgap in the 5th generation sector. China already has its J-20, and a lot of other countries have started fielding the F-35. So India has to keep pace. The Su-57 would be an excellent solution at this particular phase of our trajectory of development of India-Russia relations. Then there was the fact of the signing of the logistics support agreement. A lot of people were wondering what exactly is the gain to India for this logistics support agreement. We've signed the same with America, with Japan, with a whole lot of European countries, France, etc. So what was the gain if we signed it with Russia? A very major gain that very few people are really aware of is the northern ports of Russia, which with the melting of the Arctic, they are a bonanza in terms of trade, in terms of transit. So if India gets access to Russian ports, we could be in a position to exploit the Arctic routes that are being opened up because of the melting of the polar ice caps, because of the melting of the ice in the Arctic region. This is a very smart move, I thought. A very, very smart move. Then there are the other, let's see how this visit has proceeded so far. When the Prime Minister went to Russia, he got a royal red carpet reception at the airport, and the number 2 in the Russian government, the Deputy Prime Minister, who's just next in precedence and seniority to Putin himself, came to receive him at the Moscow airport. This is a big change from what this is an upgrade. Even Xi Jinping had not rated this level of protocol reception. India has been given a higher notch than even the People's Republic of China. After that, the red carpet reception at the airport, he went to Putin's dacha for a personal one-on-one dinner meeting with him. The whole world's cameras were focused on how the two leaders would meet, because that body language, speaks more than a picture is worth 1,000 words, is a Chinese proverb. And the picture of that body language between the two leaders, the absolute rapport, bonhomie, the way they hugged one another with bear hugs, double bear hugs, if you can please. I think that spoke a lot to the cameras. That spoke a very great deal to the cameras. It was quite clear also from the media coverage on both sides, in Russia as also in India, that the Russians were on a charm offensive, and we were very, very keen to play ball. Very keen to play ball because of mutuality of interests. Both the economies are on an upward trajectory, and this is the right time to coincide our efforts to find areas of congruence and latch onto them, strengthen these areas of congruence, and take both the economies forward at a much more accelerated rate. I think to a large extent that has been achieved. Whatever has come to us so far in terms of the Prime Minister's address to the Indian diaspora, they were ecstatic, of course, and there is very, very positive coverage in the Russian media. Quite obviously, there is a lot of trepidation in the West, and which very specifically made mention of that in terms of looking for solutions, they cautioned India that it must bear in mind the international protocols, international rules and laws, etc. Zelensky, of course, was almost very, very pungent in expressing his deep disappointment, but that is par for the course. The Prime Minister, to his credit, was very frank, very forthright. He had earlier mentioned this is not the era of war, and this time he very clearly told him that बंदूक धमाकों में बातचीत नहीं हो सकती, and the only solution to this is not through war, is not on the battlefield. The solutions have to be looked for in negotiations, in peace talks, in peace parleys. He delivered this message, I would say, even to the slight discomfiture of President Putin, which you could make out from the body language. But he delivered this message. It is to his credit. He also mentioned, which is an unfortunate coincidence, when the Prime Minister was in Moscow, the Russians had retaliation. In retaliation for the attacks on their oil infrastructure and on their cities, they had launched a massive attack on Kyiv and 6 other Ukrainian cities. They had tried to hit the presidential palace, and there are some speculations that Ukrainian or American intelligence had told them of the likelihood of such attacks, and Zelensky had gone to Putin ostensibly for a meeting with the Polish Prime Minister, but perhaps to survive the attack on the presidential palace. There we found the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, etc., have been used, which just could not be stopped by the patriots, and there was mayhem in Kyiv, there was mayhem in a number of other cities, especially towards the east, which also gives you a likely indication of the direction of the Russian offensive in the future in Ukraine. But unfortunately, there was one hit on a child hospital, which is quite tragic, and the Prime Minister did not flinch when he made a mention of this to President Putin. We are waiting for the final communique, but if some of the items that I have ticked come through, it would be a path-breaking visit. it would redefine the India-Russia relationship for aeons to come, for the decades ahead. There was much consternation in India. There was much worry that what about the China factor? The Russia-Ukraine war had driven Russia almost into Chinese arms. There was a kind of a feeling that Russia had been locked into a Chinese embrace, and that would be at the cost of India, to the detriment of India. But then Prime Minister Putin decided to go to North Korea, have a separate agreement. When that was, I think, on 19th of June and 21st of June, he was in Vietnam, another separate agreement, and which clearly gave us an indication that he is not establishing linkages between the India-China Russia triangle in that kind of a way. Look, let's be very frank. Russia does not want to play second fiddle to Russia or be a second fiddle to China or be a junior partner of China in this overall relationship. And to that extent, Russia wants to have an equally strong standalone relationship with India. That message has come quite clear, and if the protocol aspect which the diplomats have such a fine eye for is any indication, I think Putin has given a higher rating to Modi than even to Xi Jinping, and that by itself speaks volumes. And the efforts the Russians have put in to cultivate the Prime Minister of India is a clear indication that they see a lot of potential in this relationship. Now, whether this potential fructifies and we see it actualizing in the days, months and years ahead is what we are keenly waiting for the communique to come out at the end of this visit. But I don't think very many people have realized just how path-breaking it was. There was a kind of a feeling that we were trying to make up to the Russians, because that annual dialogue that used to take place between the Prime Minister of India and President Putin every year, that had been severely disrupted due to COVID. It has been disrupted due to the Russia-Ukraine war and all the kind of sanctions and that which had gone up onto it, build up into it, and then the pressure that the United States and Europe and other countries the West had put onto India to distance itself from Russia, to sort of dilute our relations and dependency on Russia in terms of weapons and equipment, and even in the energy sector, even in the trade sector, a lot of pressure was put on India. But it is to the credit of the Modi government, especially one should also mention the National Security Advisor and the Foreign Secretary, who played a pivotal role in seeing that India would not buckle to the pressure of the United States or the West and not needlessly spoil its relationships with Russia. Russia and India have a long-standing, tried and tested relationship. I personally have fought the 1971 war for the liberation of Bangladesh, and I can personally recall how the Russians, the Soviets then, pulled out all stops to come to India's aid, to provide us every weapon that we wanted, and even when we did not want, they offered us the Bear bombers, the Tupolev bombers then. It's another thing that, for very strange reasons, we declined those bombers and then used AN-12 transport aircraft for dropping bombs in Cham. But the fact is, they were prepared to give you everything that you wanted. We had a 45 Squadron Air Force then, almost entirely of Soviet equipment. Our army, the entire tank fleet, entire artillery, guns, they were all of Soviet origin. The Indian Navy was almost all entirely of Soviet Kashin class destroyers, Petya class frigates, Osa class missile boats, etc. They had pulled out every stop in that time. And then, we had signed the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace and Friendship, which was a very great boon because it prevented the Chinese from intervening. And when the Americans did try to intervene, when they steamed in the 7th Fleet with the USS Enterprise nuclear-powered aircraft carrier into the Bay of Bengal, when the Americans steamed in the 7th Fleet centered around the USS Enterprise nuclear-powered aircraft carrier into the Bay of Bengal, because Nixon wanted to tilt towards Pakistan. That is the time the Russian nuclear submarine armada, they also came into the Bay of Bengal, and they let the Americans know of their presence to deter them from any action, taking any kinetic action against India. So we have a lot to be grateful for to the Russians. That is why it is a tried and tested relationship. It had frayed at the edges, especially in the post-Soviet era, when Russia had grown very, very weak. There was a great school of thought in Russia which looked towards the West, looked for an alliance towards the West to ditch the global South, more or less. But that just didn't work out. They were taken for a ride, and then the rest, of course, as they say, is history. So there was a need to renew this cycle of annual meetings between the heads of state, and that has been done. That is why it was timed for this, the visit was timed now. It has made waves. It has created a stir because the NATO is celebrating its anniversary in the United States. All the NATO countries are there. That is the time. There was some very not so happy coincidences. Like I said, when the Russians hit 6 cities with their hypersonic missile barrage of 100 ballistic and cruise missiles, which has shaken up Ukraine and unfortunately caused a tragedy in the bargain. But that war, the whole world is keenly looking for its end. The unfortunate fact is that so were the Russians. Let's not keep blaming the Russians. Putin started a dialogue to have a ceasefire. He started a dialogue to have a ceasefire, and that ceasefire was first, talks were mediated by Belarus and then by Turkey. And the Russians had then agreed to, as a goodwill gesture, withdraw from Kyiv, which the information warfare machine in the West turned out to be a Russian debacle of the highest order. It was a goodwill gesture by which the Russians withdrew from the gates of Moscow. And then they had offered to even withdraw from the others, till there was an outcry in the Donbass and the in the Luhansk and the Donetsk republics, that what will happen to us if you withdraw. But the Russians have been very keen to have peace talks. Even now they have offered a ceasefire. Orbán, the Hungarian president, has gone to Ukraine, to Russia, and now to China to start these ceasefire negotiations. We are all hopeful that something would fructify, but given the way the war is going and given the way the Americans, the Europeans have trenchantly opposed any ceasefire, the intention there seems to be to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. And unfortunately, the bottom of the barrel as far as manpower and ammunition is concerned has already been reached in in Ukraine. And I'm not very sure how much, just given the sheer military logic of manpower numbers, the sheer logic of artillery ammunition figures, production figures, the sheer logic of weapons and the industrial mobilization on both sides. Russia has the attritional advantage, the industrial mobilization advantage, the manpower advantage. It is a futile conflict. Every day that it continues, the worst sufferers are the people of Ukraine. Also the people on the Russian side are suffering, not as much, but the worst sufferers are the people of Ukraine. But the Western world doesn't seem to be very concerned with that pain, with that angst, right? And I would reckon that the earliest we can look for a conclusion, we will always pray for miracles, and miracles do happen, but the earliest that we can look for a solution or a resolution would be October, November, December time frame, when the Russians have also exhausted their military options, have done the push that they have that has been forecasted for very long, the summer offensive, which should have started in June. The Russians have started major offensive, but as of now these are slow incremental pushes, not a major grand coup de grace kind of an offensive. So let's see which way it goes. Should India offer itself as a negotiator for peace? There are two sides to the coin. You see, Russia is keen for peace, but we saw the Swiss summit when almost 100 countries were called from all over the world, gathered from all over the world. Unfortunately, thankfully, the Indian Prime Minister did not go, and they wanted to hold peace talks without Russia. That is quite an oxymoron, that there are two sides to a conflict and you want to hold peace talks with one side not invited. So I think more saner views are required if we are really serious about peace. There is one Brazilian fronted peace initiative which China is trying to piggyback on. I think we should offer our good offices only once we get a clear indication, not just from Russia and Ukraine, but also from the United States, that they'll let a peace deal come through, that they want a peace deal. I don't think the Americans want a peace deal, not at least in the Biden administration. Like I said, they are prepared to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, with the pain all being to the Ukrainian, and my heart goes out to the Ukrainians just for that, for the amount that they have suffered. So in conclusion, I would like to state that one thing India prizes above all is its strategic autonomy, its autarky, its capability to take its own decisions on major issues without undue pressure from any quarter. As Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, he very sagaciously remarked, if the Americans have a problem in their relations with Russia, they can't expect us to spoil our relations with Russia. We have no problems with Russia. If they have, they should sort it out on their own with Russia. The litmus test of Indo-US relationships must not be the need to cut off or downgrade our relationships with Russia in case we want good relations with the United States. That either or equation, I think, is uncalled for, and India has stood its ground, even with the worst of pressure being put on it by the Americans, by the Europeans, to stop importing oil from Russia, even though the Europeans were importing oil freely from Russia and gas from Russia. And then Indians are also smart. We bought Russian oil, refined it, and the Europeans bought it from us. And India's purchase of Russian oil prevented global oil prices from skyrocketing and knocking the bottom out of the global economy. I think the world needs to thank Russia, India and China that we did not let this become a third or a fourth oil shock. So we would value our strategic autonomy the highest. We place the highest value upon our strategic autonomy, and to that extent we are trying to have multilateral relations with different countries, which are standalone relationships. We do not let one cloud over the other. Russia's relations with China are standalone and separate. They should not cloud or impede or interfere in relations between Russia and India. I'm sure Russia is not looking for a G2 world. It is looking for a multilateral world, a multipolar world, in which India is definitely a significant pole of power. And Russia would like to keep its options open. India would like to keep its options open, and we would like to have good relations on all sides. And I think so far we have kept all balls in the air. We have juggled these numerous very hot balls very successfully, which is a tribute to Indian diplomacy, to Indian sagacity, and our I think strategic planning in the pursuit of our national interest have been of a very high order. The world is full of praise because India has stood its ground. India has emerged as a standalone power center in the multipolar world. It has emerged as a significant pole. And no country can expect to bulldoze over us and dictate to us what relationships we would have with the other power centers. We will determine those relationships, keeping in view giving primacy to our own national security interests. Thank you.